You trudge along the wind-whipped dunes of Gilgo Beach, the Atlantic Ocean stretching out before you, its waves crashing relentlessly against the shore. The salty temps of sea air mixes with the faint rustle of dry beach grass, creating a soundtrack both soothing and ominous. Beneath your feet, the sand feels cold and damp, the late afternoon sun dipping low behind the clouds, casting long, skeletal shadows across the coastline. Somewhere in this seemingly tranquil stretch of Long Island, a shadow of death has lurked. For years, unseen, yet devastating. It's December 2010, and the chill in the air carries more than just winter's bite. This quiet beach is about to become the grisly stage for one of America's most baffling and haunting serial murder investigations. 4 bodies, wrapped and discarded like trash, are discovered in the underbrush near the parking lot off Ocean Parkway. The first eerie clue that a killer has been using this stretch of sand and scrubland as a dumping ground. You're listening to 102 Hours where stories don't just get told. They come alive in the dark. You probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to 102 Hours, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you are in the world right now and what your local time is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let 102 Hours guide you into tonight's journey. Your journey begins not with a shadowy figure or a desperate phone call, but with something even colder, a December wind sweeping across Long Island in 2010. A sparse layer of snow dusts, Gilgo Beach. Pristine white against dunes marked only by seagull prints and tangled grasses. You're here because, somewhere among the calm, picturesque coastline, the sands conceal a darkness deeper than the sea that hugs the shore. It's December 11th. And officers are combing this stretch of coastline, not in search of bodies, but searching desperately for clues to the whereabouts of 24-year-old Shannon Gilbert. Shannon, a young woman from New Jersey working as an escort, disappeared in May of that year after a frantic, panicked phone call. Her call had lasted over 20 minutes, filled with desperate pleas and garbled cries for help, before abruptly cutting off into static silence. Police had traced her last known location here, to these dark dunes along Ocean Parkway. But instead of finding Shannon, as their search dogs sniff through beach grass, stiff with frost, one of the officers notices his canine partner suddenly pulling ahead, ears perked, muzzle low. A small patch of disturbed sand catches his sight, subtle enough to be easily missed. Curious, you watch as the officer kneels, gloved hands gently sweeping sand away to reveal burlap fabrica rough sack, hastily buried. As he pulls at the sack, dread settles in your chest like an anchor. Inside, twisted in a chilling fetal position, are the skeletal remains of a woman. Your pulse quickens. She isn't Shannon. This isn't who they came here for. As police comb the area more thoroughly, a new horror emerges. One by one, 3 more bodies are uncovered within just a few hundred yards, each victim wrapped similarly, hidden beneath layers of burlap, like grim gifts carefully placed in a perverse ritual. Their discovery is silent but deafening, shocking even seasoned detectives. The brutality isn't graphic, it's quietly methodical. As the first news crews begin trickling in, a shadowy dread hangs over Long Island, darker than the winter skies. Themselves, you consider how police must have felt that bitter December day, faced with the realization that their simple missing person search had unraveled a thread connected to a far more sinister tapestry. And with each wave breaking on the shore, the implications sink deeper, cold and unrelenting. It becomes clear that this isn't just a case of a missing woman. This is the beginning of something far more horrific. That December afternoon feels oddly silent, even as more personnel arrive. The snow melts slowly around the crime scene tape, bleeding into pools of icy slush, mirroring the thawing illusions of safety in a sleepy, affluent community. You're now fully aware of the terrible irony. A place often called a paradise, now forever stained by secrets of murder. Local media outlets, slow at first, begin descending upon Gilgo Beach. You imagine the hesitant murmurs, the sideways glances. Each reporter secretly thrilled at the dark spectacle unfolding. A serial killer may be walking among the community, unrecognized, perhaps even smiling and nodding politely in a nearby coffee shop or grocery store. Meanwhile, behind the carefully maintained facades of Massapequa, Babylon, and the surrounding hamlets, anxiety spreads like cracks beneath polished surfaces. People lock doors tighter, double-check window latches, and draw curtains shut against a nameless fear. Yet life carries on, the haunting questions whispered quietly in kitchens and coffee shops. Who were these women? How did they end up here? Buried anonymously and quietly in burlap graves by someone who clearly knew the area well. Your eyes are drawn back to the dunes. Somewhere beneath the frosted grass and shifting sands lies the Keitha, secret to identifying the person responsible. The ocean murmurs softly behind you, uncaring of the human horrors playing out on shore. Investigators still question whether these discoveries are isolated events or part of a wider pattern stretching across state lines. The answers remain buried as deeply as the victims themselves. The Suffolk County Police Commissioner stands before the growing crowd of journalists, his face serious but reserved, delivering statements carefully chosen to reassure rather than alarm. Yet, in his eyes, you recognize the unmistakable glint of uncertainty of dread. Even he knows these four bodies, carefully hidden yet now exposed, represent merely the tip of an iceberg whose depths remain unknown. And so, as daylight fades over Gilgo Beach, replaced by the amber glow of streetlights that never quite reach the dunes, you sense this case won't simply fade away like the melting snow. Instead, it's destined to haunt Long Island for years. A whisper in the ears of residents and law enforcement, alike always there. Always just out of reach, calling softly from beyond the darkness. And somewhere, out there, the shadow responsible. Watchers, waiting patiently, perhaps even enjoying this first public performance. The stillness of Ocean Parkway is deceptively serene as your attention drifts back into the past. To the early hours of May 1st, 2010, a chilly fog drapes itself gently across the coastal highway, muffling the usual sounds of traffic. On this particular morning, silence reigns, supremely broken, occasionally by the distant cawing of gulls and the subtle rhythmic pulse of the Atlantic against the sand. Yet beneath this calm facade, something deeply unsettling is unfolding, hidden from view. You imagine the quiet, upscale neighborhood of Oak Beach, nestled just beyond these dunes, a place designed to appear safe and picturesque. A place you'd pass through without a second glance. But behind these facades lies a maze of shadowed corners and whispered secrets. In the heart of this quiet neighborhood, Shannon Gilbert's panicked cries first pierced the early morning quiet. A frantic, terrified voice cutting through the stillness, her pleas for help echoing into the phone receiver. A haunting testimony that would eventually thrust the Gilgo Beach case into the national spotlight. You envision Shannon stumbling barefoot, desperate and disoriented, down unfamiliar streets, pounding on doors of houses bathed in darkness. She must have known, instinctively, as you now feel deeply in your bones, that something horrifying was closing in, something inevitable and chillingly precise. Shannon was not a local. Like many before her, she had traveled to this affluent part of Long Island from Jersey City for a late-night appointment. A man named Joseph Brewer had hired her through Craigslist, requesting her escort services, an arrangement seemingly routine, yet ultimately destined to spiral into chaos. Brewer's house, now marked by darkness and silence, holds a secret, the true cause of Shannon's panic, still debated fiercely among investigators and armchair sleuths alike. Investigators still question whether Brewer himself posed any real threat, or whether something or someone else spooked Shannon into fleeing his home that night. You picture Brewer, momentarily jolted awake as Shannon begins screaming, her voice echoing through the neighborhood. A call made to 911 from a concerned neighbor captures fragments of Shannon's panic-garbled pleas. Indistinct accusations, screams slicing through layers of confusion. By the time police arrive nearly an hour later, she has vanished into the fog-shrouded darkness, her footprints erased by the dampness of morning dew. This critical lapse, the delay in police response later, becomes a sticking point for critics of the Suffolk County investigation. If officers had arrived sooner, could Shannon have been saved? It's a question without an answer, but it hangs there, heavy and unyielding, wrapped in the silent mist of regret. Months pass without answers, Shannon's case fading slowly from public view, overshadowed by other headlines and local scandals. But then, in December 2010, as police search again for her remains, 4 other bodies appear beneath the sands of Gilgo Beach, revealing a twisted truth that no one was prepared to face. Yet Shannon herself remained elusive, a ghostly absence. At the center of it all, raising questions that stirred uneasily beneath the surface of official explanations. Shannon's family, driven by grief and suspicion, refused to let her disappearance be quietly forgotten. They pressed authorities relentlessly, determined to uncover why their daughter's frantic final moments hadn't triggered a more vigorous response. During one particularly raw moment in your reflection, you imagine how Shannon's mother must have felt each time authorities dismissed her concerns. A mother who sensed something darker lurking beneath surface explanations. Knowing instinctively her daughter had not simply disappeared, someone knew the truth. Someone living close by, walking freely among them all. And then finally, a year and a half after Shannon disappeared, her remains were found less than half a mile from where she was last seen. But instead of clarity, her discovery only deepened the mystery. Officially, Shannon's death was classified by authorities as accidental, attributed to drowning or hypothermia in the marshes near Oak Beach. Yet the Gilbert family vehemently rejected this conclusion, insisting Shannon's death was part of the same sinister pattern that claimed so many others. This stubborn contradiction, that official stance versus family suspicion, clings to the Gilgo Beach murders like persistent fog. Even now, investigators still question whether Shannon's death was simply a tragic accident or something far darker. Perhaps the earliest glimpse into the shadowy violence, later unearthed in the sands, in the backdrop of Shannon's heartbreaking end, the larger, even darker canvas began taking shape. Police unearthed the remains of other young women, hidden deliberately, methodically wrapped in burlap, suggesting something chillingly ritualistic about their placement. The police began connecting dots, seeing clearly for the first time that what initially appeared as isolated tragedies actually painted the portrait of a calculated, cold-blooded predator. Yet there remained an unsettling distinction. Shannon, Gilbert herself, whose disappearance had started it all, didn't match the pattern exactly. Her remains were found separate from the carefully concealed graves. She had not been wrapped neatly in burlap. Did this indicate a different killer, or perhaps a killing committed in panic? One less controlled, one fueled by fear rather than meticulous calculation. You ponder how these distinctions must haunt investigators. Each detail a tantalizing breadcrumb that leads nowhere, creating more questions than answers. But in the minds of many, including Shannon's family, this difference proves nothing except that murderers sometimes deviate from their patterns, especially when something unexpected forces their hand. As twilight shadows stretch across Oak Beach, you can almost feel Shannon's presence lingering, unresolved and restless. The neighborhood, serene again in appearance, holds its breath beneath the surface, afraid perhaps to acknowledge the darkness that brushed so close, then faded quietly into anonymity once more. And standing here, beneath an early evening sky, slowly swallowed by darkness, you sense with certainty that the story of Shannon Gilbert will never truly rest. It remains an open wound of question without answers, the uneasy heart of a case that continues unraveling. And somewhere beyond your sight, another shadow moves quietly, patiently waiting for the world's attention to fade again, just long enough to return unnoticed to these quiet, lonely shores. The salt air carries a faint trace of summer, though the calendar says otherwise. You find yourself walking along the rough edges of the dunes, where the sand begins to darken with the dampness of ocean spray. Here lie the first bodies discovered, 4 women whose lives and deaths suddenly brought chilling clarity to a mystery that had until then been whispered about only in the shadows. Maureen Brainard Barnes was the first to be identified. She was a local, a 25-year-old, known for her bright smile and quiet kindness, but also her struggles with substance abuse. You can almost hear her laughter, maybe a little too loud, in the background of a bar she frequented, the music a constant companion in her life. When you imagine her last night, it's unsettling to think how her routine might have been disrupted forever by a man lurking just out of sight. Then there was Melissa Barthelemy, just 24, from nearby Ronkonkoma, a mother, a daughter, someone trying to rebuild her life. Her friends remembered her as a fighter, yet she vanished without a trace. Now she rests beneath a thin blanket of sand, wrapped in burlap, a silent testament to the terror that stole her away. Megan Waterman, only 22, was last seen working the highways, just like many of the other victims. You picture her standing under streetlights, wary but determined, when darkness found her. Amber Costello, 27, rounds out the Gilgo 4, a woman with dreams and plans erased in the cold grip of the killer. These women were not random. Each was an escort or involved in sex work, leading some to overlook them, to dismiss their disappearances as part of a dangerous lifestyle. Yet you can feel, just beneath the surface, a growing sense of outrage. This was not just tragedy, but injustice layered upon injustice. The discovery of these 4 bodies, all wrapped in burlap and concealed carefully among the dunes, sent shockwaves through Suffolk County. Investigators began to realize the scope was far larger and darker than anyone had imagined. Their burial pattern suggested a killer with knowledge of the remote, hard-to-access Pachiza hunter familiar with the geography, and cruelly precise in his methods. But you might wonder, why burlap, the coarse fabric often used for sacks or bags, hints at a practical mind behind these killings. Someone who went to great lengths to conceal evidence, but without elaborate staging. It's a grim signature, a calling card of sorts, whispering secrets to those who dare to listen. Locals grew wary, glancing uneasily at every passerby, questioning who among them could harbor such monstrous intent. The beaches became simultaneously a place of peace and dread, their beauty marred by invisible stains. The Gilgo Four were more than victims. They became symbols of a community's vulnerability and a justice system's challenge. You might not realize this yet, but the ripple effect of these four discoveries would reach far beyond the shorelines of Long Island. The search for answers, justice, and closure for these women would expose deep flaws in how society views and protects its most vulnerable. Strangely, some investigators quietly whispered that these four might just be the beginning. There was talk, not publicly shared at first, about other bodies yet to be found, hidden carefully in places only a shadow knows. This sense of an unseen, growing body count created an undercurrent of tension that gripped Suffolk County's law enforcement. At the same time, families of these women had to grapple with public prejudice. Because of their occupations, the media often painted them in unflattering light, sometimes reducing their lives to stereotypes or simple headlines. You can feel how this diminishes their memory, turning them into anonymous statistics rather than real people. But you can also see the Defiance families banding together, refusing to let the world forget these women were daughters, sisters, friends. They demand justice, demanding recognition that their lives mattered beyond the circumstances of their deaths. One particularly eerie detail adds a strange texture to these discoveries. Investigators found evidence suggesting some victims had been kept alive for days or even weeks after their disappearances. Disturbing, fragmented clues like cell phone pings and sporadic sightings fuel this possibility. Did the killer play a cruel game, holding victims captive before delivering final death? Investigators still question whether this chilling scenario was reality or just a hopeful fantasy clinging to desperate minds. You might find it hard to imagine how the Gilgo Four changed the narrative for young women's lives. Abruptly ended and cruelly hidden, drew attention to a serial predator lurking beneath the surface of an affluent suburban community. Their deaths cracked open the facade, revealing a world most would rather not see. So you walk the sands where they were found, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows. Each footprint you leave feels heavier, as if carrying the weight of their stories. The wind whispers through the grass, a soft echo of voices that can no longer speak but demand to be heard. The Gilgo Four mark the turning point, no longer missing persons, but victims of a calculated killer whose shadow stretches far. Beyond these dunes, you trudge deeper into the salt-tinged air, where the coastline's dunes seem to stretch endlessly, their shifting sands holding secrets that refuse to settle. As winter gives way to the chill of early spring, a new wave of discovery shatters the fragile calm surrounding Gilgo Beach. This time, it's not just for victims. It's more, much more. Between March and April of 2011, the grim count rises. The skeletal remains of Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack emerge, unearthed from separate sites, each discovery more haunting than the last. Jessica was 35, a mother of two, who, like many victims, led a life of quiet struggle. Valerie, only 24, had just turned her life around, trying to leave the shadows behind. Their deaths ignite fresh terror, proving the horror that began in the winter is far from over. And then, as if the night refuses to relent, 3 Jane Does emerge, women whose names are lost to time, their identities buried as deeply as their bodies. Their anonymous presence adds a chilling layer to the story. You try to imagine who they were, dreams, fears, smiles forever unrecorded. Among them, the remains of a toddler are found, small and fragile, a heartbreaking reminder that innocence sometimes falls victim to. The addition of these bodies expands the scope dramatically. No longer just a string of individual tragedies, these deaths reveal a systematic predator operating with terrifying efficiency along Ocean Parkway. Each new discovery raises questions and tensions that ripple through local communities, stirring paranoia and fear. The burlap wrappings remain consistent, an ominous signature pointing to the same perpetrator or group. The killer's knowledge of remote areas, the ability to evade law enforcement for so long, suggests a calculated and experienced hunter. Someone familiar with the intricate geography of Long Island's beaches and back roads. Yet you might wonder, how could so many bodies go unnoticed for so long? The area's natural cover dense brush, marshlands, and remote access points provided a macabre sanctuary for the killer. Investigators speculate the perpetrator might have used local boats or vehicles able to navigate these hidden paths. A chilling thought, the killer could live among the community unnoticed. Walking freely past neighbors, families struggle with the wait for answers. As bodies surface, hope for identification mingles with despair. DNA testing moves slowly, hampered by the degraded state of remains and cross-contamination. Still, every small breakthrough, each positive ID offers a glimmer of justice. A step toward naming victims stolen from the light. One unsettling detail emerges as a source of debate. Among investigators, the discovery of a toddler's remains. Among adult victims, could this child be connected to the killer? Was this an accidental victim or part of a more disturbing pattern? Some experts suggest the child could have been related to a victim or even the killer, though no consensus exists. Investigators still question whether the toddler's death is linked to the same series or a tragic coincidence. Meanwhile, the discovery of 3 Jane Doe's women, whose identities remain a mystery, fuels theories that the true scale of the killings could be larger than suspected. Without names, without stories, they represent the unknown victims of a predator's shadow. You feel the weight of their silence, a haunting echo that presses on the minds of those searching for justice at the same time. The law enforcement response grows more complex. The Suffolk County Police Department coordinates with federal agencies, forensic experts, and victim advocates to tackle the unprecedented scope of this case. The media, meanwhile, begins to pay closer attention, though the victims' backgrounds as sex workers complicate coverage. The challenge of public sympathy versus stigmatization becomes apparent as families fight to reclaim their loved ones' dignity. You catch whispers of frustration behind closed doors as officers voice doubts about the thoroughness of early investigations, fearing critical evidence may have been overlooked or mishandled. These murmurs hint at deeper problems: bureaucratic delays, understaffing, and perhaps even bias that slowed the case's progress. This sprawl of discoveries raises a terrifying possibility that a serial killer or killers have been active in the region for years, their crimes hidden in plain sight. The thought sends a shiver down your spine. The peaceful community you might have trusted now feels tainted by the unseen. The malevolent presence lurking just beyond the dunes. As spring sun warms the cold sands, you sense the slow, grim march of justice underway. Each uncovered body is a beacon, a voice demanding to be heard. A puzzle piece in a nightmarish mosaic. The shadow cast by Gilgo Beach grows longer, darker, and more complex. And somewhere in the twisting shadows, the killer watches and waits. You wouldn't know it from the headlines at the time, but Gilgo Beach had already become a graveyard for women hidden beneath the dunes, found within days of each other. And yet, silence. The kind that makes your skin crawl. The kind that suggests some stories don't get told not right away, and not for everyone. You begin to sense the pattern. These weren't just any victims. They were sex workers. Women who, in the eyes of many, had slipped between the cracks of society. And in that brutal gap between perception and reality, a killer found his hiding place. The response, especially from the media, was muted, clinical, almost indifferent. A quick segment here, a buried article there. You wonder if these women had been teachers or suburban mothers. Would the headlines have screamed louder? Would the news vans have parked outside City Hall? Would the public have paid attention? Sooner, behind closed doors, families of the victims were screaming into the void. They begged for help, for urgency, for recognition. Instead, they got judgment. Whispers of a tryst lifestyle and dangerous choices hung over them like fog, masking the deeper truth. Someone was murdering women and burying them in plain sight. You feel that ache, the helplessness of knowing something terrible has happened, and still having to convince people it matters. That your daughter, sister, mother didn't deserve to be forgotten because of how she made a living. The beach didn't care what jobs they held. Neither did their killer. Law enforcement's early posture mirrored the public's apathy. Resources were slow to arrive. Investigative energy fizzled. It wasn't a cover, a pit was worse. Disinterest. And disinterest, in cases like this, can be deadly. It wasn't until the fourth body turned up that things began to shift. The sheer scale, the undeniable pattern forced attention, but the damage was done. Precious time had been lost. Evidence possibly gone forever. And most damning of all, a killer emboldened by society's shrug. You overhear things in coffee shops, the way neighbors lower their voices when the topic comes up. They lived that kind of life, someone mutters. What did they expect? That kind of quiet cruelty, soft, deadly bias that devalues lives not for who they were, but for what society decided they represented. And the killer, likely counting on it. He knew who wouldn't be missed right away. He knew whose phone calls would be ignored longer. He knew how long it would take before someone actually started looking. But cracks were forming. A few journalists began digging deeper, asking uncomfortable questions, pushing past the stereotype. True crime bloggers caught on to people started saying their names. Maureen, Melissa, Megan, Amber. Real people, real lives. One podcast episode in particular went viral, not because it was sensational, but because it was quiet. It played the 911 audio of Shannon Gilbert's final call, her voice shaking with terror. You could hear the desperation, the confusion, the heartbreak. Suddenly, the story wasn't abstract anymore. It had a sound. A soul. Slowly, the tide turned. Vigils were held on the beach, candles flickering in the sea breeze, mothers and daughters, standing shoulder to shoulder, holding up photos of the women the world had tried to erase. A fragile kind of power began to bloom in those gatherings, proof that visibility could still be reclaimed. Still, investigators remain haunted by a question. Had the early media attention and internal police response been more urgent? Could more lives have been saved? Could the killer have been stopped sooner? Or was the system always rigged against these women from the start? A quirky little detail lingers with you. The name Gilgo Beach Killer wasn't even coined by police, it was the media. Late to the scene, trying to catch up to the horror they'd initially ignored. Almost as if naming it was a way to control it. But you can't control a ghost. And this one was already wandering. The silence surrounding Gilgo Beach wasn't accidental. It was built layer by stigma, discomfort, and indifference. And while that silence eventually cracked, it came too late for too many. Now you listen harder. To the wind sweeping over the dunes. To the questions still whispered in courtrooms and living rooms. To the names that still deserve to be spoken. You follow the shoreline where the breeze carries more than salted hums, with a presence that never left. A whisper just out of reach. A shadow with no name. They call him the Long Island serial killer. Lisk, for short. But the truth is, no one really knows who or what they're looking for. Lisk isn't a person you can picture. No sketch, no voice, no smoking gun. Just a collection of bodies. A pattern so tight and cruel that it feels more like math than madness. Whoever did this wasn't messy, wasn't impulsive. This was someone who planned, who studied, who understood how to vanish behind the veil of ordinary life. And that's what terrifies you the most. Because Lisk could be anyone. Investigators noticed right away the burlap, the spacing between the bodies, the timing of their disappearances, the use of remote coastal burial sites, almost ritualistic in their precision. This wasn't someone getting lucky. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly where to do it. But as more bodies turned up, doubts crept in. The victims weren't all the same. Some had been missing for years. Some bore signs of different methods. Some were posed, others not. Suddenly, the theory of one killer began to splinter. You lean into the unease. What if there's more than one? That theory, multiple killers, split the task force into two camps. One side believed in a singular predator, a man who evolved over time, shifting methods to avoid detection. The other side feared something even worse, that several killers, either unknowingly or deliberately, had used the same stretch of beach as a dumping ground. Investigators still question whether the pattern is evidence of one meticulous murderer, a grim convenience shared by more than one, a place where bodies disappear into the marshes, swallowed by the wind and the waves. There's an even darker fringe theory that a ring of predators existed, a small network operating beneath the radar, trading knowledge or covering for one another. No evidence has confirmed this, but the longer the case drags on, the more people wonder, what kind of monster hides best? The one who wears a mask or the one who blends into a crowd? You glance at the timeline. Some victims vanished in the early 2000s, others just before the 2010s. Could one person really sustain such a long campaign of horror undetected? Or did someone new pick up where another left off? The digital age adds its own layer of complexity. Craigslist ads, burner phones, GPS pings. The killer or killers knew how to play the system. They erased footprints even before they were made. Law enforcement faced a wall of firewalls and dead ends, time and again. Cold cases grew colder. Tips evaporated. Then came the surveillance footage. Grainy clips, a truck passing, a shadow near a phone booth. Nothing conclusive, just enough to tease the kind of details that feed forums and podcasts, where theories bloom like mold in the dark. 1,000 detectives with keyboards, convinced they've cracked the code. But no one has. Not yet. And still the whisper remains. What if Lisk has never stopped? It's a chilling thought. That somewhere out there, the killer reads the headlines, watches the documentaries, listens to the interviews, smiling quietly, safe behind anonymity, like fog behind glass. One curious detail floats into your mind, something unearthed during a 2012 investigation. Calls made from a victim's cell phone, taunting her family, placed from near Madison Square Garden. Who does that? Who murders, then mocks? That wasn't just cruelty, that was control. You imagine him, a figure standing in a payphone booth, the glow of the city behind him, calmly dialing the number of a girl's sister, then whispering something unspeakable, and walking away like nothing happened. The detectives assigned to this case still lose sleep. You can sense it. Some have retired. Others still return to the case file late at night, staring at the same blurry maps and lab reports, hoping for something, anything that might shift the narrative. Because deep down, they know what you know. This wasn't random. This was orchestrated. And the person responsible walked away again and again. The name Lisk has become more than a label. It's a symbol of every unsolved piece of this mystery, every unanswered phone call, every mother who never got closure, every scream that never found ears. And so, here you are standing in the surf, wind tugging at your sleeves, staring down a coastline that once promised peace. But now, you see it differently, not as a beach, but as a cemetery without headstones, a place where evil didn't just visit it, moved in, and the worst part, it might still live here. You pause outside a drab-looking courthouse, brick walls sun-bleached and quiet, the kind of building you pass every day without a second glance. But inside, files are stacked, whispers are exchanged, and a name keeps resurfacing. John Bit. Not exactly a household name, but in the world of unsolved murders and slow-burning dread, his shadow looms larger than most. He was a local, a construction worker, big guy, quiet, gruff, the kind of man you'd see at a gas station, buying a black coffee, nodding politely. You wouldn't look twice, but you might now. Back in 2014, Bitrolf was convicted for the murders of two women, Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee, both sex workers, both strangled, both dumped in remote parts of Suffolk County. And here's the twist: you lean in, because this part gets fuzzy fast. Their deaths happened in the 1990s. That's right, decades before the Gilgo Beach bodies were discovered. Still, something about the details, location, victim type, cause of death started itching at investigators. The pieces didn't quite fit, but they didn't quite not fit either. For years, Bitrolf sat in prison, serving a 50-year sentence, as rumors swirled like gulls above the dunes. Could he be Liss? Was this the man behind the burlap? The killer who vanished into the wind? Investigators still question whether John Bitrolf is connected to the Gilgo murders. There's no definitive forensic link, no hard DNA match tying him to the beach. And yet, the circumstantial clues pile up like sandbags. One detail gnaws at your mind. One of the Gilgo victims, Melissa Barthélemy, had a sister who claimed to have received disturbing phone calls after Melissa disappeared. The voice on the line, mail.com/mocking. Some say Bitrolf didn't fit that profile. Too blunt, too simple. But then again, who really knows how evil is supposed to sound? Here's where things get a little strange. You ready? Turns out, the daughter of Rita Tangredi, one of Bitrolf's confirmed victims, was friends with the daughter of another possible Gilgo victim. Some called it a coincidence, others weren't so sure. That fragile web of proximity, of personal ties, sent some theorists into overdrive. You can almost hear the message boards humming. And then came the Burke connection. James Burke, the former Suffolk County police chief who oversaw part of the early investigation into the Gilgo murders, was later arrested for, well, let's just say, assaulting a suspect and obstructing justice. His behavior drew scrutiny. His circle raised eyebrows. And wouldn't you know it, Burke and Bitroff came from the same area, same age range, same era. You feel the conspiracy, theory forming, like smoke curling into something heavier. Was it a cover-up? A tangled web of local corruption? Or just a storm of unrelated facts that happened to pass through the same town at the same time? Even seasoned investigators tread lightly here. They admit there's no direct link between Burke and no documented interaction. But the optics, as they say, aren't great. You walk the mental tightrope. If Bitroff did kill in the 90s, is it so impossible to believe he kept going quieter, smarter, more methodical? Or did someone else learn from his crimes, adopting his pattern to muddy the trail? What you do know is this: John Bitroff didn't just appear from nowhere. He lived in Manavel, less than 15 miles from where some of the dismembered remains were found. Specifically, the torsos of victims, Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack, were discovered near his old stomping grounds. That's not just geography. That's proximity with a pulse. But again, no proof. No smoking gun. Just proximity and dread. Heuermann, the man who would be arrested nearly a decade later, wasn't even on the radar when Bitroff's name first came up. And that's what keeps this case tangled. Two men, both plausible, both monstrous in their own right. One behind bars, one now awaiting trial. You step back from the files, from the grainy photos, from the maps marked with pins and red string, and you're left with this unsettling truth. Sometimes the most terrifying part isn't what we know. It's what we almost know. Maybe Bitroff was a monster, but not the monster. Or maybe he was the first and original whose legacy of horror became a blueprint for someone even worse. Either way, the bodies kept turning up, and the beach kept swallowing its secrets. The mask finally cracks in July of 2023. A name emerges from the shadows: Rex Heuermann, a hulking, bespectacled architect from Massapequa Park. Not exactly the figure you'd picture when imagining a serial killer. He looks more like a man, concerned with spreadsheets and zoning permits than one who might stalk women by night. You pause. The irony clings thick. Heuermann's home is mere miles from Gilgo Beach. He lived comfortably with his wife and children, just a short drive from where the Gilgo Four were unearthed. A soft-spoken professional by day, yet, as the investigation reveals, allegedly something else entirely once the sun dipped behind the dunes. His arrest comes after over a decade of dead ends. A major break in the case arrived not from some dramatic chase or whispered tip, but from, of all things, a leftover crust of pizza. You can practically see the scene, detectives sifting through his trash, retrieving the uneaten remnant, hoping it would tell the truth, and it did. DNA recovered from that crust matched genetic material found on burlap used to wrap at least one of the victims. The authorities also recovered hair samples from the crime scene's hair they now believe came from Heuermann's wife. While she was reportedly out of state during the times of the murders, the implication is chilling. Had the killer used household items, bringing fragments of his family life to the horror he orchestrated? You can feel the moment the pieces begin to click. Heuermann owned a green Chevrolet Avalanche, matching the vehicles seen by witnesses near one of the victim's last known locations. His internet history told an even darker story. Searches for torture devices, victim photos, and body disposal methods that left investigators visibly shaken. And there was something else, something less forensic, more psychological. The man had compiled a detailed document titled Agak2 002 -04. Though the exact content hasn't been publicly released in full, what's known is chilling enough. It catalogued elements of the murder's methods, body positioning, even possible staging ideas. Some say it read like a project file, a grotesque spreadsheet of control and obsession. Investigators moved quickly once the evidence aligned. In July 2023, Heuermann was arrested outside his Manhattan office. The cold face of an allegedly double life staring out from under heavy glasses. A quiet man, a meticulous planner, and, if proven guilty, a predator who hunted with disturbing calculation. Neighbors, predictably, expressed shock. You hear them say things like, "He was just quiet," or "He kept to himself." But beneath those clichés lies the real horror. Evil can wear a normal face. The killer you imagine lurking in the shadows might be buying coffee behind you in line, making polite small talk while carrying secrets stitched with silence. Still, the case isn't over. Heuermann has pleaded not guilty to all charges. His legal team insists on his innocence, and the burden of proof rests on the prosecution. Yet the growing mountain of evidence, from digital footprints to DNA, has painted a portrait that many find hard to deny. As you picture him now, sitting behind a courtroom table in an orange jumpsuit instead of a business suit, you realize this isn't just about one man. The arrest of Rex Heuermann reignited the investigation. It shook the community out of its uneasy slumber, and it breathed new urgency into the search for justice, not only for the known victims, but for others who may still be missing. Authorities have reopened old files. They're revisiting crime scenes, interviewing witnesses who long thought their memories irrelevant, and they're asking the public to come forward with anything, any flicker of detail that might point to a broader truth. Investigators still question whether Heuermann acted alone, or if his arrest is just the beginning of unraveling a wider network of horror. Some believe there could be more victims, more secrets, more darkness waiting to be unearthed beneath the shifting sands. You return your gaze to Gilgo Beach. The dunes haven't changed much. The wind still whispers, and the tide still rolls in. But now, with a name finally attached to the long-feared shadow, the silence feels heavier. The ground may yet yield more than bones. It may reveal a truth too twisted to accept, too important to ignore. You're sitting in a quiet room, the kind with humming fluorescent lights and thick stacks of paper breathing in file drawers. Across from you, a detective flips open a file, one unlike anything you've seen. It's not a case folder. It's a plan, a script, a digital document titled Agak2 002 -04. That name might sound like an internal code or an architectural file, fitting for someone like Rex Heuermann. But this wasn't blueprints for a home. No, this was something far darker. Inside were 87 bullet-pointed entries, painstakingly organized thoughts about killing, lists of tools, locations, notes on body placement, comments about restraints, ligatures, timelines. The level of detail suggests someone obsessed, someone methodical. You shiver because it doesn't read like a fantasy. It reads like a checklist. You picture him, sitting alone in his Massapequa Park home, typing, scrolling, adjusting, tweaking, not rushed, not frantic, focused. It's chilling. Not because of what it says, but because of how normal it must have felt to him. Like writing a shopping list. Investigators were stunned when they found it. The file had been buried deep in Heuermann's personal computer, hidden but not deleted, as if part of him wanted to revisit it, like a blueprint for murder he could admire over and over. And it wasn't just theory. The document included references investigators now believe correspond directly to victims already linked to Heuermann. Specific comments about weights used, methods of disposal, even the number of burlap wraps applied. It wasn't fantasy, it was memory. You feel the room grow smaller, because you realize, if this file is reland so far, it checks out. Maybe the most damning piece of evidence yet. Not just proof of action, but intent. Premeditation, control. A fringe detail in the file sticks with you. One line reads, "Don't forget to clean under the nails this time." Casual, specific, horrifying. Not something you say when you're imagining a story. Something you write when you've done it before. It's these quiet details that make the HK-200204 file a potential linchpin. Prosecutors have already begun referring to it in early court proceedings. And although the full document hasn't been released to the public, pieces have emerged, hinting at a disturbing level of organization now. Think about that name, HK. Some believe it stands for Hinterkaifeck, a reference to an unsolved family murder case in Germany. Others suggest it's short for hunting kit. The numbers, maybe dates, maybe victim codes. Investigators still question whether the title itself is a cipher, a code only the killer understands. But here's the twist that chills you. Parts of the file don't match any known victims. There are entries that describe scenarios, tools, and timelines for people who haven't been found. Not yet. That has authorities scrambling. Are these just hypotheticals? Or are they blueprints for past murders that no one's discovered? Could there be more bodies buried, deeper, dumped farther, never reported missing? The implications weigh heavy. Because if HK-200204 is truly a record, not a fantasy, then we may only be at the surface of what Rex Heuermann is responsible for. The room becomes quieter still as you learn this. Some of the file's entries align disturbingly well with dates when Heuermann's family was out of town. Times when he was alone, unaccounted for. Times when a man like him, quiet, calculating, might slip away into the dark with his tools, his burlap, and his plan. What kind of person writes a document like this? Not scribbled in a notebook, not a cryptic journal. A Word doc, neatly formatted, labeled, file. You realize then that this isn't about rage. It isn't about loss of control. This is about power, ritual, a sense of mastery over life and death, like an architect designing not homes, but tombs. And while you sit with that thought, the silence between the clicking of your clock feels thicker. The beach is no longer just a crime scene. It's a canvas, and he may have drawn on it far more times than we've ever known. The case isn't built on theory alone. It's built on lives, real, breathing lives that were once part of this world. And now, you look each one in the eye, not as a name on a court file, but as a person who laughed, worked, worried, and loved. You begin with Maureen Brainard. She had 2 children. She once worked in a telemarketing office. You can picture her sitting by a cracked window with coffee in hand, sketching out a plan to get her life back on track. She hadn't done escort work for months when she decided just once more. She took a train to New York in July 2007 and was never seen alive again. That was the last anyone heard from her until she was found wrapped in burlap, her body carefully placed in the sand. Then there's Melissa Barthélemy, a 24-year-old from Buffalo. She was smart, organized, and rarely missed check-ins with her family. Her disappearance in July 2009 didn't go unnoticed. What came after was something out of a nightmare. Her younger sister received phone calls, taunting, cruel calls from Melissa's phone. The male voice on the other end mocked her, made lewd comments, and said Melissa was dead. The calls were traced to Manhattan. Someone was playing a game, a sick, cruel game. Megan Waterman, just 22, had a young daughter waiting at home. She vanished from a hotel in Hopodge in 2010. Her boyfriend said she left to meet a client and never returned. Megan had a habit of texting her sister every night. When the texts stopped, her family knew something was wrong. They pushed, they searched. They put her face on flyers, hung posters on telephone poles, and still, silence. Amber Lynn Costello, 27, had moved to Long Island from North Carolina. She struggled with addiction, yes, but she was fiercely protective of her sister, always offering up a sarcastic joke when things got hard. On the night she disappeared in September 2010, a man had reportedly contacted her multiple times. Witnesses say he arrived in a green Chevy Avalanche. She left the house barefoot, promising to return shortly. She didn't. These 4 women, now known as the Gilgo 4, shared more than occupation. They all advertised on Craigslist. They were all petite, white, and in their 20s. They all disappeared within a tight 3-year span. They all had loved ones who noticed they were gone, who kept calling, searching, refusing to let the world forget. The details echo each other. They were all wrapped in burlap, placed within a few hundred feet of each other along Ocean Parkway. They were found facing east, in similar positions. These weren't random deaths. This was someone's design. And that someone investigators now believe was Rex Heuermann. Hair found on the burlap of 3 of the women allegedly matches mitochondrial DNA linked to Heuermann's wife. Again, she was out of town during the murders, but it suggests the killer transported materials from the home, bundles of evidence, touched by people who had no idea what they were being used for. Burner phone records link back to anonymous calls made to arrange meetups. The phones followed a pattern, purchased in Manhattan, used only to contact the victims, and powered down permanently after each murder. Cell tower data placed those phones in Midtown Manhattan during the day where Heuermann worked and in Massapequa Park at night where he lived. You get a glimpse into his methods now. Cold, clean, controlled. Even more chilling, one of the burner phones was used to check voicemail messages of the victims after they disappeared. Someone wanted to monitor things, see who was looking, hear if anyone knew. This isn't rage, this isn't chaos, this is orchestration. But it's not just the Gilgo. Authorities believe Heuermann may be connected to 3 more women: Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, and one still unidentified. Jessica and Valerie were both dismembered, their torsos found in Manorville, years before their skulls and limbs were matched and recovered along Ocean Parkway. These women don't fit the neat pattern. They're from different backgrounds. Some of their remains were dumped differently, but prosecutors argue the similarities, the control, the disposal, the locations suggest a common hand. Still, investigators remain cautious. Prosecutors are focused on what they can prove. Heuermann has been charged with 6 murders as of now, with more charges potentially pending. And here's the haunting part. 3 of these women were found by accident. If not for the search for Shannon Gilbert, they might still be buried. You wonder how many others are still out there, still missing, still unheard. There's a heaviness in your chest as you piece them together. Not just names, not just photos. They were real, they were here, and someone took them away with deliberate, calculated cruelty. And maybe, if that someone hadn't gotten comfortable, hadn't slipped, hadn't left behind a pizza crust in a city trash can, maybe he would have done it again. You pause at the sound, faint, almost a murmur, but unmistakably human. A voice over the phone, whispering words that should never be spoken. The room chills as you lean in, because this next chapter isn't just about murder. It's about cruelty that lingers long after the act is done. The voice, mocking, measured. Mail. After Melissa Barthelemy vanished in July 2009, her teenage sister began receiving calls. Not one, not two, but 7 of them. Over 6 grueling weeks. The caller never shouted, never panicked. Instead, he was calm, calculated. He knew exactly what to say to burn fear into the soul. He insulted Melissa, described what he claimed to have done to her body, called her sister by name, laughed, and then hung up. You imagined that phone trembling in a young girl's hands. A family gathered around the receiver in a silent living room, holding their breath, hoping for a voice, a clue, anything. And when it came, it wasn't closure, it was torment. Authorities quickly traced the calls, not to some random payphone in the woods, but to Midtown Manhattan, Times Square, Madison Square Garden, crowded places where cameras watched and people moved shoulder to shoulder. The killer had used the crowd as camouflage, a needle hiding in the stack of needles. Police believe the caller used Melissa's own phone, a move designed not just to taunt the family, but to prove possession, to show control, to say, I have her, and now I'm speaking through her. You don't just kill someone and do that. You relish it. You feel it, now the psychological profile forming in the shadows. This wasn't a man who killed in a rage. This was someone who played with people, who enjoyed watching the suffering bloom in real time. And Melissa wasn't the only one. Other families reported strange phone activity after their loved ones went missing. Missed calls, voicemails from blocked numbers, sometimes silence, sometimes static, sometimes breath. You might think these were random, a glitch, a crossed wire, but no, too many, too frequent, too targeted. Investigators dug deep into phone records. Burner phones appeared again and again, disposable, untraceable, but consistent in their pattern. Most were activated in Manhattan, then used only to contact victims through escort ads on Craigslist or Backpage. Always the same rhythm: reach out, arrange a meeting, and then ... nothing. One chilling clue: some burner phones were never used again after the victim disappeared. They simply went dark like the women themselves. But there were exceptions. In a few cases, the killer kept the phone alive just long enough to check voicemail messages, delete call logs, or place those gut-twisting calls to family members. Investigators still question whether those lingering phone traces were slips of arrogance or part of a broader controlled tactic, a way to stay involved in the chaos he'd created. And then came the cell tower triangulation. Using technology previously unavailable in earlier phases of the case, law enforcement mapped locations where those burner phones pinged. The result, a tight corridor stretching between Midtown Manhattan and Massapequa Park. Daytime signals from the city, nighttime signals from Long Island. You follow the rhythm. The phone would go quiet during work hours, then spring to life in the evening. Always measured, always focused. The geography told its own story, and that story led them to a man who lived in Massapequa Park and worked in Manhattan. An architect, a family man, a figure no one suspected. Until now. But here's something stranger still. Some of those same phones weren't just used to contact victims. They were also used to search for news articles about the case, to follow media coverage, to keep tabs on the investigation's progress. It was as if the killer wanted a front row seat that more than anything suggested obsession, not with the act alone, but with the aftermath, the impact, the echo. He wanted to see what happened. When the stone hit the water, he wanted to measure the ripples. And in one bizarre instance, one of the phones pinged near a victim's family home. No call was made, no text, just presence. A ghost standing across the street, watching. Imagine that. Now you start to feel what the families must have felt, being haunted not just by loss, but by presence. That awful sense that someone is still there, still circling, still enjoying the pain. It's not just about the murder, it's about the performance. Investigators would later uncover Google searches on Heuermann's devices, allegedly tied to victims' names, news updates, and even law enforcement procedures. Not just idle curiosity, surgical, obsessive dives into how police work, what evidence is admissible, and how killers get caught. And yet, for years, he didn't. He walked among them, day after day, while families left voicemail messages for women who would never answer, and detectives listened to hours of silence hoping for a slip. That slip, when it came, wasn't from a phone call. It was from a pizza crust. But in this section of the story, you hear the voice first. Quiet, arrogant, practiced, and you realize the scariest killer isn't always the one who hides in the woods. It's the one who dials your number. It always comes back to the details, the kind of evidence too small to notice, unless you're looking closely. The fibers, the hair strands, the DNA tucked into a strand of burlap like a fingerprint nobody meant to leave. That's where the killer started to slip. You're sitting at the center of a web now, one spun from years of misdirection. Lost files, bad leads. But with the arrest of Rex Heuermann, investigators had something they hadn't had in over a decade. A man, a name, and a map of digital breadcrumbs, all leading inward. One of the most significant breaks. Hair. Several long human hairs were recovered on or near the victim's remains, preserved in the folds of burlap. Years passed before science caught up. But when it did, when mitochondrial DNA testing became more precise, those strands began to speak. They didn't shout, but they whispered. Whispered a surname, whispered a household. Not Heuermann himself, but his wife. It sounds impossible. She wasn't even in the state during the murders. Travel records prove she was out of town. But that's exactly what made it more chilling. Because if the hair came from her, it didn't come from the crime scene. It came from home. It traveled. With the killer, maybe stuck to the burlap. Maybe to a piece of tape. Maybe to the killer himself. That revelation shifted everything. It told investigators the killer had a domestic space, a launch point, where items were prepped, where victims were selected, contacted, and perhaps even stalked. He didn't find victims randomly. He hunted them with intention, from a place that once smelled of dinners and furniture polish. But the real weight of the case fell on the digital trail, the kind no one used to think twice about. Google searches, burner phones, email aliases, cell tower pings. All of them, in hindsight, painting a clear image of obsession and movement. Heuermann's alleged searches included phrases like, "Why hasn't the Long Island serial killer been caught? Best ways to get rid of a body. Can police trace burner phones? What does DNA survive on?" It's not just disturbing, it's telling. He wasn't curious, he was studying, researching, preparing. And then there were the emails. Investigators found at least 4 burner email accounts allegedly used to contact sex workers and escort services, with requests eerily similar to the details recorded in the HK 200204 document. The language was polite, formal, almost mechanical, but underneath there was an edge, a familiarity with the process. This wasn't someone just exploring, this was someone acting. Another damning trail came from cell phone analysis. The same burner phones used to contact victims were mapped through triangulated data. Patterns emerged. Pings near Heuermann's home, pings near his Manhattan office, pings that followed his daily commute. The phones would activate long enough to arrange a meeting, then disappear forever. And yet the paths they took overlapped again and again with Heuermann's known locations. Coincidence? Unlikely. Statistically, nearly impossible. And there was still more. Search history on hidden folders within his computer. Thousands of images of known victims, others of unidentified women. Images scraped from escort ads, surveillance sites, even old news reports. A private gallery of faces frozen in fear or seduction. But investigators still question whether every image connects to a murder. That's what keeps them up at night. The possibility that the list of victims isn't finished, that some haven't even been reported missing yet, or worse, were never missed at all. A fringe fact quietly emerged during discovery. One of the email addresses Heuermann allegedly used was tied to fantasy forums, where users discussed hunting scenarios involving women. Roleplay maybe. But it aligns too neatly with the tone of the case, with the clinical precision of his supposed victim file. He didn't need to roleplay. He had a real canvas. So where does that leave? The big question. Are all of the Gilgo Beach bodies tied to him? That's where the pattern starts to wobble. Some victims were dismembered, others weren't. Some were posed, others buried hastily. The Gilgo for shared consistency, size, background, method of wrapping. But others, like Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack, were dumped years earlier and found in multiple pieces, sometimes counties apart. Could one man truly change his methods that drastically? Investigators are split. Some believe yes, that a killer learns, improves, adapts. Others believe there were at least 2 killers operating independently, their paths overlapping on the same stretch of cursed sand. And there's another layer of uncertainty: the timeline. Some remains date back to 1996. Heuermann was in his early 30s then, married and not yet working in high-profile architecture. Could he have started that early? Or is there another, older predator still out there? Even now, as the trial builds momentum, law enforcement walks a tightrope between certainty and possibility. They have enough to pursue charges for several murders, but the full picture, it's still forming. You feel it, too, that uneasy sense that the frame is too big for one portrait, that this story is wider, deeper, more sprawling than even seasoned detectives care to admit. And the scariest thought, we might still be missing the beginning. The wind rolls colder now as you step closer to the edge of what remains unsolved. Gilgo Beach has revealed many of its secrets, but not all. There are still names we don't know, lives without backstories, remains without identities, and worst of all, no one looking for them. 3 sets of bones, 3 Jane Does, and a toddler, found buried near the others, but with just enough difference to pull them slightly out of frame. Their presence here complicates the narrative, and you can feel it, the discomfort of what doesn't fit neatly in the box. The first is Jane Doe number 3, also referred to as Peaches. She was found dismembered, her torso wrapped in plastic and discarded in a wooded park in Nassau County back in 1997. But it wasn't until 2011 that her severed head and limbs were discovered near Gilgo Beach. Her identity remains unknown. Her only distinct mark, a heart-shaped peach tattoo on her left breast, faded now, but once vibrant dot. Then comes Jane Doe number 7. Later identified through genetic genealogy as Valerie Mack, a young woman from Philadelphia. But her ID took decades to confirm. Her partial remains had been scattered between 2 counties, her torso found in Manorville, her skull and hands near Gilgo, dismembered, meticulously divided. There's no other word for it. Controlled, another haunting presence. Baby Doe, approximately 2 years old, found wrapped in a blanket near one of the adult victims, believed to be her mother, yet never confirmed. No name, no missing persons report that fits. Just a child placed in the sand, gently, as if someone felt something like regret. But regret doesn't stop murder. And then there's Jane Doe number 6, whose remains were found just 250 feet from Baby Doe. Her skull was located years later in Nassau County, again suggesting dismemberment and deliberate disposal in multiple locations. You start to feel the pattern fray. These victims weren't simply hidden. They were fragmented, moved, piece by piece, across county lines. It's not just concealment, it's message, or ritual, or maybe practice. This is where law enforcement hits a wall, because these remains were found in the same corridor as the Gilgo 4, but their treatment is different. Their timeline is different. Their entire method of disposal suggests a different mind, or at least a different phase in the same twisted evolution. Some investigators believe this might indicate more than one killer. A theory gaining traction is that 2 distinct MOCs are at play, one favoring precision and wrapping, another favoring dismemberment and spread. Both used the same dumping ground. Both operated in silence. But were they the same person wearing different masks, or different monsters entirely? And that brings up the darkest theory of all one investigators rarely speak aloud but can't fully dismiss: a shared hunting ground. That Gilgo Beach, isolated and wild, became a known location among predators. A secret code whispered on message boards or in quiet circles. A place where bodies could disappear without a trace until someone looked too close. Investigators still question whether some of the unidentified victims were killed by Heuermann, or if his alleged crimes merely overlapped with those of another. Could he have stumbled across someone else's territory, or built his own pattern atop older horrors? You stand there imagining the unspeakable, 2 killers passing in the night, leaving behind clues neither intended to share, or worse, one learning from the other. And the toddler, her presence complicates everything. She doesn't belong in a narrative built on sexual predation. Her inclusion suggests something more chaotic, something emotional, something uncontrolled, or a mistake. Some theorists argue she may have been present during her mother's abduction, a witness, a complication. The killer didn't plan for a child and, yet still made the choice to end her life. You want to believe it was a panicked decision, but the way she was wrapped, the way she was placed, there was care. As if whoever did it paused for just 1 second. That second haunts more than all the rest. Even now, DNA testing continues. The advancement of forensic genealogy has already helped identify one victim previously listed as a Jane Doe. Could the others follow? Could someone, somewhere, cousin, a sibling, an old friend, be carrying the missing piece of this puzzle without knowing? Maybe, but time makes ghosts. And the longer a body remains unnamed, the more likely their story fades into the static. That's the danger. Not just that the killer goes free, but that the victims remain invisible. You whisper to yourself, remembering the tattoo peaches. Someone knew her. Someone gave her that ink. Someone may still be out there, not knowing her body was found, not knowing she's part of something much larger and darker than anyone could imagine. So now you stand with the unnamed, the fragmented, the lost, and you feel something sharp in your chest. Not fear, not even horror. It's grief, because they weren't just victims, they were forgotten. The camera pans across a coastline that now feels iconic, infamous. Drone shots of Gilgo Beach roll slowly across the screen, wind-whipped grass, grey skies, the curve of the highway, and that unshakable sense of unease. You recognize it instantly, not because you've been there, but because you've seen it in documentaries, news specials, podcasts, and viral clips. Gilgo Beach has become a character in its own right, a place where secrets breathe and the sand forgets nothing. Over the years, the story grew beyond Suffolk County. It became a national obsession. And with that spotlight came questions, not just about the killer, but about the people who let him go unseen for so long. You scroll through streaming services and see them everywhere now. Titles like The Killing Season, Lost Girls, The Long Island Serial Killer, A Mother's Hunt, and more recently, Unraveled, Long Island Serial Killer, and Netflix's The Lost Girls. Each one promising insight, answers, and maybe closure. But they do more than tell the story. They point fingers at investigators, at local officials, at the entire culture of dismissal that allowed these women to vanish without setting off alarms. In Lost Girls, based on the book by Robert Coker, you watch the fictionalized retelling of Mari Gilbert's real fight to keep her daughter Shannon's case in the public eye. Amy Ryan plays Mari with a clenched jaw and tired eyes. It's not a horror film, it's a grief film, and you feel every second of her desperation. You hear her voice reel footage, this time in press conferences. They didn't care because of what she did for work. That line echoes louder than any forensic detail, because it's the wound beneath the crime scene. The thing no chalk outline can capture. Systemic invisibility. Documentaries like The Killing Season dig deeper, not just into the murders, but into the strange landscape that allowed them to happen. Suffolk County politics, jurisdictional turf wars, and a police chief, James Burke, who would later be arrested for corruption and violently assaulting a man in custody. It's almost too cinematic. A police chief with a dark past, a task force that kept the FBI at arm's length for years, and a community willing to look the other way so long as the violence stayed out of view. But this isn't fiction. This is a true crime tale where the dysfunction is part of the body count. You sense that the media narrative began to shift only when the pattern became impossible to ignore. Once the number of victims crossed into double digits, Once the stories stopped being about a missing escort and became about a broken system, then, and only then, did people start paying attention. A quirky little twist in all of this. Before the documentaries, before the Netflix specials, it was the online sleuth community that started piecing it together. Internet forums like web sleuths, early Reddit threads, even YouTube channels dedicated to unsolved mysteries, kept the pressure alive long before cable news caught on. One blog long since archived had tracked the victims' names, missing persons reports, and police missteps as early as 2011. It wasn't always accurate, but it was relentless. You realized that in some strange way, these amateur sleuths filled the role the system didn't. They remembered the women when no one else would. Investigators still question whether outside media coverage helped or hindered the case. Some argue it pressured law enforcement into action. Others believe it muddied the waters, created noise, false leads, even inspired copycat theories that distracted from real clues. And yet, without that spotlight, would Rex Heuermann ever have been caught? The pressure was mounting long before the pizza crust sealed the deal in 2023. When his arrest hit the airwaves, you could feel the public whiplash. The man didn't look the part. A quiet architect with a wife, kids, a suburban home, a Manhattan office. He wasn't the dark-eyed drifter we imagine in ghost stories. He was boring, and that made it worse. News segments showed aerial shots of his Massapequa Park home, investigators carrying out boxes, computers, bags of evidence. Reporters interviewed neighbors. He kept to himself, they all said. We never suspected. A thing, that phrase echoes throughout true crime history. Neighbors never suspect. Killers never look the part. And the victims often don't make the front page. But now, the tide is turning. After years of being reduced to footnotes, these women are being spoken about as people again. Their stories being told in full. Not just how they died, but how they lived, what they dreamed of, who they loved, who they left behind. Netflix's The Lost Girls ends, not with a killer behind bars, but with a mother screaming in the dark, her voice rising above the ocean. You don't see a conclusion. You see a demand. Do not forget. And now, with trial proceedings on the horizon, that demand grows louder. Podcasts air weekly updates. Streaming platforms release new interviews. Social media floods with theories, timelines, diagrams. You wonder if justice is finally coming, or if it's just a new kind of performance. Still, it matters. Because every time a viewer watches, every time someone says a victim's name out loud, it pushes back the darkness just a little. You look out at the beach again, no longer a silent stretch of sand, but a stage. One where, finally, the forgotten are being heard. And where the question that haunted Suffolk County for over a decade now echoes louder than ever. How many were there? And who are we still missing? The courtroom feels colder than it should. Sterile still. The kind of place where the air doesn't move unless someone exhales too sharply. You sit toward the back, eyes locked on the man at the center of it all. Rex Heuermann. Larger in person than expected, but somehow smaller, too. He doesn't look monstrous. That's the unsettling part. He looks like someone who might ask you to hold the elevator. Heuermann has pleaded not guilty to all charges. And while the evidence mounds a twisted document file, hair DNA, cell tower, pings, digital searches that map almost too perfectly, the law demands due process. A trial, facts, testimony, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. You watch as lawyers move like chess players, deliberate, measured. The prosecution lays the groundwork, carefully outlining what they call a pattern of behavior too specific to be coincidental. They lean into the science. Mitochondrial DNA from the hairs found on 3 of the victims. The timing of the burner phones, the searches, the emails. But they're also smart. They know jurors are human, so they talk about the women. They show photos. They play the 911 call. They don't shy away from who the victims were, how they were treated in life. Because this case is not just about catching a killer. It's about listening to those who were ignored the first time. Heuermann's defense team pushes back. Hard. They challenge the validity of the DNA evidence, citing the commonality of mitochondrial profiles. They question the phone records, ask about chain of custody. They highlight the years of delay between discoveries and arrests. They want you to believe this is all a coincidence, an unfortunate overlap of behaviors and geography. Nothing more. You wonder, could someone else have mimicked the killer's methods? Or worse, could the real killer still be out there, letting Heuermann take the fall? Investigators still question whether Heuermann acted alone, or if his capture has simply closed one door while others remain wide open. After all, not all of the remains discovered along Ocean Parkway fit his profile. Not all were bound in burlap. Some were dismembered, some belonged to men. And then, of course, there's the toddler. The DA's office has hinted that more charges may be coming. Ongoing DNA tests, newly uncovered phone records, even re-examined travel logs are all under review. They're leaving the door open quietly, carefully, for the possibility that the body count isn't complete. And that means you can't close this chapter either. The trial is expected to stretch on for months, maybe longer. The backlog of evidence is massive. Dozens of witnesses, hundreds of digital files, a decade's worth of grief. And through it all, the families wait. Some wear their daughters' photos around their necks. Others carry folders, press clippings, autopsy reports, statements they'll read when the time comes. There's one mother, face worn but unshaken, who told a reporter, "I don't care if he rots in jail or not. I just want my daughter's name cleared." She was more than how she died. And that's what sticks with you. Because this case was never just about bodies in the sand. It was about whose stories we choose to tell, whose disappearances make headlines, whose lives matter after they're gone. Outside the courthouse, the air carries a different kind of quiet than Gilgo Beach. There's no ocean here, no dunes, just pavement, car horns, and the low murmur of reporters on the sidewalk. But the silence feels just as heavy, because no matter how this ends, the mystery isn't over. The media's swarm around the case has rekindled interest in other disappearances, some stretching back 20 years. Cases once buried in old filing cabinets are now being pulled back into the light. Some detectives, long retired, have returned to assist. Cold case units are expanding. The search is far from over. And you realize something crucial. Even if this trial ends in conviction, the story continues. Because what Gilgo Beach uncovered isn't just a killer, it's a system of silence. One built on shame, on stigma, on the dangerous idea that some lives are worth less than others. That illusion's been shattered now, and it can't be put back. So you step away from the courthouse steps, one foot in shadow, one in light. You walk slowly, deliberately, past the waiting cameras, past the notepads, past the speculation. You head back toward the coast, where the waves never stop, and neither do the ghosts. Somewhere out there, more answers wait, more names, more justice, and maybe, just maybe, Someone is watching again, only this time, it's not the killer watching the world. It's the world watching him. Asterisk, you settle in now, deeper into your chair, letting the heaviness of the story melt into something softer. The details, so vivid just moments ago, begin to fade like footprints along the tide. Each wave brushes away another fragment until only stillness remains. The beach is quiet again. The crime scene tape is gone. The press vans have rolled out, and all that's left are the whispers drifting gently on the wind, just beyond what you can quite hear. But you know they're there. You always will. In this silence, there's something else, something almost peaceful. The kind of peace that comes not from forgetting, but from witnessing. You were here. You walked through every step, every breath, every unanswered question. And now, the names that once felt like headlines feel more like memories, like echoes of lives that mattered. You close your eyes for a moment and picture them not where they were found, but where they might have been, at a birthday party, laughing in a sunlit kitchen, singing along to a song in a car with the windows down. Not lost, not broken, just here. So take a breath. Let it out slowly. The shadows are fading now. The story has been told, and you made it to the end, perhaps a little changed, perhaps a little more awake. Sleep well tonight, if you can. Sweet dreams.